As Alistair Carmichael is unable to join us this morning, I was asked to step in to chair the meeting. It's good to see colleagues from both houses coming on the call, and some from outside too. The background to the meeting is, first of all, by the way, that it's being recorded and therefore will be available to people after the meeting has ended and will be placed online. But the background is that it's been jointly organised by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong and by the grassroots pro-democracy campaign Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong. The guest speaker this morning is Steve Vines, who will be known to many of us as a British journalist who spent the last 34 years in Hong Kong and has now fled that Chinese territory for the UK because of what he's described as a white terror, which is sweeping the city, and was making journalism a very high-risk occupation. In addition to being a journalist, Steve is also a writer and restaurateur who is based in Hong Kong from 1987 until this year. He's worked for The Observer and as a correspondent for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The Independent, Asia Times, and he was the founding editor of Eastern Express and founding publisher of Spike. Recently, Steve was involved with the startup of Hong Kong Free Press. He's the author of several books, including Hong Kong, China's New Colony, The Years of Living Dangerously, Asia from Crisis to the New Millennium and Market Panic, and most recently, Food Gurus. His latest book, Defying the Dragon, Hong Kong and the World's Largest Dictatorship, has just been published by Hearst Publishers in London. He's also published Sai Kung for All Seasons, that came out in 2012. He was a founding member of the Civic Party, one of the political organizations being targeted by the Chinese government during their crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong. Several senior members, of course, of that organization are in prison now or have fled Hong Kong for their safety. We're very grateful to you, Steve, for giving your time this morning to tell us about this white terror, as you've described it, sweeping the city, and to give us your take on what the future probably holds for the people of Hong Kong during this awful time, where all of us who love that wonderful city have seen such a deterioration in fundamental freedoms and basic liberties. You're extremely welcome to join us today, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. And after that, there will be a Q&A. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, David Alton, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you to everybody who's participating in this. I'm very aware that people on this call have been making significant contributions to ensuring that what's happened in Hong Kong is neither overlooked nor forgotten, and I am therefore very happy to be speaking to be in the company of people who have that record. But let's talk about what's going on. And I start with a word of caution because I know there's very well-informed people who are participating in this session. So much or some of what I say may be familiar, but I put it in just in the interests of context, because although I'm most familiar with what's happening to the media, it is, of course, not happening in isolation. I was one of those people who was very reluctant to accept the notion that the founding concept of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, as declared by Deng Xiaoping in the mid-80s, of one country, two systems, was dead. I thought that was an exaggeration. I thought it was going too far. And I just thought, you know, there was still two systems in operation. The fact is that erosion of the two systems began not in 1997, when Britain ceded power to the People's Republic of China, but before that, when China had already declared that the elected members of the legislature would be thrown out. They established their own provisional legislature, and of hand-picked people, of course. And, you know, so even before we got to the first hurdle, it was clear that erosion was going to take place. What I think was important though was you still had freedom of expression, quite a lot. You still had a legal system that was intact, and you still had other aspects of liberty that hadn't been destroyed. The problem was the direction of travel was ominous, but not fatal. And a lot of us, and I hold up my hand as a guilty party here, were still maintaining illusions. I think one of the main illusions was that the enormous crackdown that was going on in the mainland once Xi Jinping assumed power would somehow not affect Hong Kong, or if it did, it wouldn't be as crucial as it was on the mainland itself. I think that when the national security law was imposed last year, the time for illusions ended. There could be no mistake of the level of the crackdown. Indeed, there was barely a moment to pause, to draw breath, because the speed of the crackdown was just overwhelming. I mean, I would wake up every morning and turn on the radio news. I could barely do that without hearing of somebody being arrested, this organization being closed down, these limits imposed, etc., etc. I mean, it was day after day after day. And of course, it continues. The only difference for me is I'm not on the premises anymore. And I think that this is something, the sheer speed of it took everybody by some surprise, even those who had been anticipated that such a thing would happen. The pace has been terrifying. And where are we? Effectively, the right of assembly has been abolished. I mean, they're using the paper-thin excuse of the COVID outbreak for doing it, but people who are not part of the opposition seem still able to assemble, so I assume that's not true. Even the judiciary has been subverted. I mean, in national security cases, there is no longer the right of trial by jury. Judges are being selected by the executive. This is a major erosion of the independent judiciary. There has been arrest and detention of practically every significant leader of the opposition. And there's this reign of terror. I mean, it's running through the schools, it's running through universities, it's running through the entire gamut of civil society. And it's like watching matchsticks fall, you know, it just goes clash, clash, clash as they come down. And then, of course, there's freedom of expression. Now, unfortunately, I've had something of a ringside seat in observing how that has been diminished. I was a columnist for Apple Daily, the last remaining mainstream newspaper supporting the opposition. And I was the presenter of the only English language television program, current affairs program put out by the broadcaster Radio Television Hong Kong, which is indeed Hong Kong's public broadcaster. The immense sadness of going into the television house, which is the headquarters of RTHK, day by day, and seeing the level of depression among very good people who work there. When I say the level of depression among them, of course, every day I went in, and I only went in once a week to do this program, there were more and more empty spaces. People had been fired. People had simply despaired and walked away. I mean, it was not a happy place. And you know, RTHK, and obviously I don't include my own program in this, but RTHK is a very essential part of Hong Kong society. Some of the iconic programs that have been produced particularly by the television station, although the reach of the radio operation is much wider, like the famous Lion Rock program, they are part of the fabric of Hong Kong society. Not only have all of these programs either been destroyed or subverted, but the new management installed with its team of commissars who are running around censoring all the programs that still exist, have gone so far as to destroy the entire archive of the organization, are presumably because it may well contain things that were embarrassing or are embarrassing in the light of recent developments. Fortunately, Hong Kongers are smarter than the idiots who run the station and managed to rescue a lot of this archive before it went down. But that's Hong Kong initiative from you, which incidentally you cannot destroy, even though there is a serious attempt to do so. The experience that I had on the Pulse was just extraordinary. I mean, the program was censored before we went on the air at the planning stage, even minutes before it was due to be broadcast. I mean, these people, of course, knew nothing about broadcasting. They knew a lot about political correctness, but nothing about broadcasting, and thought that a television program could be changed at the last minute, literally at the last minute. I'm talking in one instance, 3 minutes before it went to air. So I was watching this process going on. It was a dark process, but I think that the thing that shocked me perhaps more than that, because it was, I wouldn't say it was gradual, it was quite fast, but it was slower, was the arrest of Lo Fung at the airport. Now, Lo Fung is a columnist, or was a columnist, for Apple Daily. And he was the editor of the English language version of Apple Daily, which was what I was a contributor to. The reason I was so shocked by this was because we had been consistently ensured, I had been personally assured in doing interviews on the program and on a radio show that I was also involved in with officials who kept saying there will be no such thing as thought crime, even after the imposition of the national security law. So why is Lo Fung sitting in a jail? He hasn't been tried. In fact, all of the people, bar one, arrested under the national security law haven't been tried. They're just endlessly detained with bail denied. But why was Lo Fung arrested? The only possible explanation is because of his thoughts, because of what he wrote in Apple Daily. There is no other. I mean, he's accused of subversion. He's accused of collaboration with foreign powers. I hope they didn't think I was a foreign power because I collaborated with him, but there you go. What we are seeing is an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. You know, if you operate as a journalist in Hong Kong today, and I can tell you this directly, you exercise the most extraordinary caution. You make sure that you make most of your communications through encrypted devices on social media. You make sure that you regularly purge your computer and your phone of information about contacts and sources of information, because if the police arrive at your doorstep at their chosen time of dawn, they will target your electronic media before they do anything else and go through it meticulously, taking out any information that could lead to further arrests or what have you. So we were all busy in the game of hiding materials, keeping it away from the possible hands of the law enforcement authorities. This is not a healthy thing to be doing. But of course, it is entirely typical within dictatorships. I mean, this is what they all do. The difference in Hong Kong, and it's a difference which is very, very important, is that Hong Kong has enjoyed liberty, had enjoyed freedom of expression. Many of the dictatorships you see around the world, including, of course, the dictatorship in the mainland, didn't arise in a situation against a background where liberty had prevailed. There had been, previous to the imposition of the dictatorship, quite a high degree of authoritarian government, in some cases, no worse than the new dictatorship. This is not the case in Hong Kong. Hong Kong never had a high degree of democracy, but it did have a high degree of liberty. And I think I know for a fact, that was the reason why I first came to Hong Kong. I was sent there by the Observer newspaper as the Southeast Asia correspondent, and it was known in the region that if you wanted a secure base with free flow of information, with no restrictions on visas and all the rest of it, to report the region, Hong Kong was the place to go. It was free, it was open, you would not be hassled. And there was a halcyon time in Hong Kong, and in the middle of that, in 1994, I had the opportunity, as David has just said, to become the editor of this new English language daily newspaper, the Eastern Express. Well, as anybody in the media knows, setting up a newspaper is quite a trying business. I don't recommend it for the faint-hearted. But of all the difficulties that we had at that time, the one thing that never bothered us, that never took up any time at all, was looking over our shoulders to see what the authorities would do, would they ban it, etc., etc. Those considerations were quite literally the least of our worries. So what we're now seeing is that the differences between Hong Kong and the mainland are shrinking to such an extent that the similarities are becoming greater than the differences between Hong Kong and the mainland. You know, the basic law, the mini constitution of Hong Kong guarantees freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of movement. But you know what? So does the Chinese constitution. And the fact that this has all been written down in law doesn't affect the reality on the ground, that the freedoms which are enshrined in law simply have ceased to operate. The Chinese constitution, if you like fiction, is a wonderful document, and I'd recommend it to you. Of course, it gets changed quite frequently, but nothing is forever. I think that what is astonishing is that you have a situation where in Hong Kong between 2019 and last year, 2020, you had more arrests for political reasons in Hong Kong than you had in the entire Chinese mainland. The local quislings who are running the government in Hong Kong are, to put it mildly, zealous in trying to impress their bosses with their loyalty and patriotism. And now in Hong Kong, we have things that will be familiar to anybody who studies dictatorships. The Stasi-like informer hotlines, so you can snitch on your neighbors and colleagues. The purging of schools and universities of dissident or so-called dissident teachers. And the almost wholesale destruction of civil society organizations who do not toe the line. And then, of course, you have, and this will be something that the long deceased George Orwell would have recognized with some glee, the moments of sheer farce. It's ominous farce. It's not something that I recommend to anyone, that you have as the dictatorship sinks its claws into Hong Kong. And it was seen most recently with the arrests of these speech therapists who had the temerity to write a children's book about sheep who refused to obey. Goodness me. I mean, these people are in jail facing charges of subversion. They could be in jail quite easily for at least 10 years. This is the most serious case of sheep tampering I've ever come across. So I think what we're talking about are zealous local enforcers, people, I use the word quisling because it is appropriate. These are what they are. They will not stand up for Hong Kong. They will only stand up for the masters in Beijing. And to justify this sweeping crackdown on society, they've depicted society as being seized by disorder, by subversion. The chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, even went so far as to call in locally based diplomats from the consulates to tell them that Hong Kong was facing an overwhelming crisis of terrorism. I've lived in Hong Kong for a long time. The last time anybody bombed me most certainly wasn't in Hong Kong. So this was the rationale or the justification for this sweeping crackdown. In all of the explanations of what happened, no mention is ever made of these enormous protests, particularly in 2019, which were overwhelmingly peaceful and involved literally millions of citizens who certainly were not inclined towards violence and didn't take part in it. But you know, it is the habit of dictatorships to rewrite history. Of course, they have to keep rewriting it as the leaderships change, either to glorify the new leader or to justify whatever needs to be justified on that particular moment. But the idea that Hong Kong people caused the crackdown is, I'll just use the word disgusting, but it's certainly unacceptable. At most, the protests of 2019 accelerated the process of this crackdown, but it's becoming increasingly evident that the Xi Jinping regime in Beijing had got fed up with the idea of one country, two systems, couldn't understand why it was still functioning in Hong Kong, and at one stage or another would have brought it to an end. So maybe the protests accelerated it, but I don't think they changed the basic course of travel. And where are we? I mean, I just speak personally. I obviously have left Hong Kong. I mean, frankly, I was scared. I was also demoralized. But there was another very big reason why I decided to leave. I'd had this 3-decade or so long experience of living there. It was a fantastic experience. And I didn't want my relationship to Hong Kong, my memory of Hong Kong, to be such a dark memory. I thought if I stayed there, I would just be overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening, rather than being able to put in perspective the wonderful people who live in Hong Kong and the fact that a society which is loved by me, but it's loved by people who live there, is being destroyed and becoming a nightmare. So Hong Kong is losing, I mean, whether I go or not doesn't matter, but it's losing vast numbers of people who are the brightest and the best. And Britain is very fortunate to be having these Hong Kongers coming here. I expect they'll be making a significant contribution to Britain, as they have to Canada, as they have to the United States, as they have to Australia, which are other places which have become targets of resettlement for Hong Kongers. I think all of us, though, would, given a chance and given a change of circumstance, want to go back. That's not an option at the moment, so I'll leave it on that point. Thank you.
Steve, I know that I speak for all colleagues from both houses who are on the call, and those from the diaspora as well, who have been listening to what you've said to us today, that we're all incredibly appreciative of the very candid way you've spoken to us, and your last remarks where you talked about having been scared, but also having been demoralized as well by the experience. I think that really touched me, what you had to say about that. But the description that you were giving in your remarks as well, I mean, it brought me back to the early 1980s when, as a young MP, I went to Hong Kong. And I was writing a report about Vietnamese boat people, some of whom had arrived in Hong Kong. And I remember being interrogated by the Hong Kong press, who were full of life and animated in most extraordinary ways. And most recently, when I was last in Hong Kong for the elections in 2019 as one of the observers for those elections, no Hong Kong journalist would lightly let you off the hook. And the interviews with them were terrific, because you knew that they were pursuing truth, that they wanted to know answers, and that this was an open environment. And yes, it was still a long way short of what we would describe necessarily as a democratic society, but the trajectory on which it had been on over that previous 20, 30 years was extraordinary. And I agree with you that the genius of two systems, one country offered so much hope for people. It was a genuine attempt to find ways forward, and the destruction of that has been, for me, one of the most saddening, depressing experiences that I've had in politics over this period. you described how the pace in which this has gone on has been terrifying, how the right of assembly has been removed, the judiciary subverted. I was very struck by what you said about the destruction of the archive. It's almost like Cambodia and year zero, as though you can eradicate the past in some way, the destruction of memory. But I was also struck by what you said about the ability of Hong Kongers to find plenty of ways of holding those things in their hearts and retaining memory as well. But also your description of fought crime and of what you said was an ominous farce, and the role of quislings and collaborators, which again for many of us has been very depressing to watch, to see people who should stand for the rule of law, who should stand for democratic values and human rights, and who have done none of those things, but have been collaborating in the destruction of the freedoms that so many have enjoyed. And those of us who know people like Jimmy Lai or Margaret and some of the other big figures from the Hong Kong democracy movement, and who knew Joshua Wong. I held meetings here in Parliament for Joshua and indeed for Nathan Law, who is one of those who has now settled in the United Kingdom. But how sad is that, for this next generation of people who should have been giving life to Hong Kong, who were the heirs of Martin Lee. And when you see men like that arraigned in court, or you see young people who should be the future of Hong Kong denied the right of public office and the national security law being used to hunt people down, then it does, as I say, lead to a very depressing sense of where we are and where we could have been as well. Now, I know colleagues will want to ask questions. If I may use the opportunity to set them off. I mean, in a way, one of the things that you've touched on is the daily abuse now of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees that everyone should be able to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through media, regardless of frontiers. And there is a certain irony that China, the People's Republic of China, now sits on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And one wonders whether journalists worldwide are giving you support and making an issue in other jurisdictions of the very points that you've been raising with us today. I mean, is there a worldwide campaign to ensure that China is held to account for these violations of Article 19? And can you tell us also a little bit about what journalists are most afraid of in Hong Kong? Their right to report being stripped, their news outlet being blocked, incarceration, the safety of their colleagues, their families. I mean, what are the things that most disturb them? And then if colleagues wouldn't mind putting up their hands in the chat function, I'll then turn to them. I think Laura Finlay, Baroness Finlay, is the first to have done so, and I'll go to her next, Steve, after you've replied. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that. In answer to the two questions, let me take the first one first. You know how it is. Attention of other people's affairs is never that consistent. And understandably so. It's a big world, lots going on. You know, everybody's focused on Afghanistan at the moment, and rightly so. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that's happening there. But I have to say that I'm very impressed by the level of focus on Hong Kong, this tiny little pimple on the backside of China with a mere 7.4 million people living there. I think that China is being held to account to some extent by the level of coverage of what's going on in Hong Kong. I've personally been speaking to a great number of people from media outlets literally around the world since I arrived in Britain. And, you know, there is a very high level of interest. I think Hong Kong has sort of, despite its small size, has sparked a little ping of recognition. There's something about Hong Kong that gets, I mean, David, you've been there, but even people who haven't been there sort of think of Hong Kong as this perhaps quirky place, but this enormous anomaly in China, you know, a bit of China that has freedom. That is an anomaly. There's no doubt about it. And it's been used to considerable extent. About the matter of what fears us journalists have, I think number one is incarceration, and that's for very good reasons, given the mounting level of arrests that have taken place. Number two, or maybe it is number one, who knows? Number two, anyway, is the sheer fact that the space to be employed in journalism is shrinking by the day. People, the hundreds of people, or actually thousands of people who work for Apple Daily, are very unlikely to find a job anywhere else. No other media organization will employ them. And incidentally, as is the system on the mainland, if you've got a black mark on your character through bad associations, it will be very hard to find jobs elsewhere. So there's the practical issue of once you've been forced out or have volunteered to leave some form of journalism, will you be able to gain employment somewhere else? Unfortunately, I know a lot of people, a great many people, who are worried about this. But, and it's a very big but, there are still people, particularly in online media, who are doing the job courageously. I mean, almost recklessly courageously, in my view, are doing the job of trying to be journalists in the sense that all of us, I believe, would understand journalism to be an open, inquiring kind of business. And they are still doing it. They're still doing it from within Hong Kong. A lot of them have retreated, particularly to Taiwan. And bizarrely, have retreated to Singapore. I mean, what does this tell you? When I first came to Hong Kong, I was regularly filing stories on the appalling nature of the lack of freedom of expression in Singapore. So now you find media organizations going, well, you know, Singapore's not so bad. It's a lot better than Hong Kong. I mean, that's not, I would say, something for Hong Kong to be proud of. So in summary, what I would say is it's not a healthy place to be. It's not a healthy situation to be a journalist in Hong Kong. If the people who are still there are managing to continue with their jobs, they're clinging on. They're not doing it with full bodily support. And I can only assume, and I hate to say this, that the situation for them will get worse.
Thank you for that, Steve. I was struck earlier on, incidentally, when you were talking about the vivid example of speech therapists being arrested in Hong Kong, and connecting it to something you've just said about you're surprised in some ways about how, given all the other issues that there are around the world at the present time, not least Afghanistan, nevertheless the interest that there is in Hong Kong. Something has touched people here in the UK because of our special relationship with Hong Kong, but examples like that. I mean, my wife, who is a speech and language therapist, put pen to paper and wrote to the Times for the first time in her life, pointing out the irony that an occupation which is actually dedicated to giving people voice was being suppressed in this way. I mean, there was a particular irony about it, but I think that ordinary people have been shocked and struck by the massive erosion of liberties and freedoms. And of course, because of the exodus of many key people, those voices and your voice will keep those issues alive in people's hearts and minds. And I think that the CCP have massively underestimated the way in which that will happen around the world because of what is now a diaspora, but also people who are connected. I mean, when you take the trouble to start trying to stop members of both houses of parliament, for instance, from being able to express their views, when you start trying to blackmail countries into compliance over things like climate change by saying that if you continue to raise the rights of Uyghurs or democracy in Hong Kong, then we won't cooperate in the future. This has so overstepped the mark that I think it's been like a wake-up call. I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Baroness Finlay, and then we'll go to Wira Hobhouse, who's also raised her hand. So over to you now, Ilora.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And Stephen, thank you for speaking so openly. I had many connections with Hong Kong for decades and did a lot of teaching there, particularly prior to handover, and saw quite a change initially at the time of handover. Now, I'm in medicine, and I just have become aware that my friends in Hong Kong are now no longer making contact. And if they do, it's extremely superficial. It's simply to tell me that, their child passed their exams and everybody's doing well. It's only good news. And even when it's down to personal problems in their family, such as one of them, her sister was dying, but even that has been toned right down. And I wonder whether you are seeing reflected in scientific work and medical output and research and moving those frontiers forwards, which Hong Kong clinicians did hugely. They were very much at the forefront of it. Whether you have any monitoring or know of how that has also dropped back and become more formulaic, if you like, rather than creative and imaginative.
That's very interesting. On the question of communications, I think most people in Hong Kong assume that if you communicate by email or more open networks like that, you are highly likely to have your communications intercepted. So I think that explains, I'm sure you know that, but I just to make the point. The other point you make is really interesting, and I'm almost certainly less informed than you are on these matters of medical research, but let's just take what's been happening recently with the COVID outbreak. In Hong Kong, there's a panel of advisors to the government, as there is in Britain, obviously, on the virus. And they have been performing the most extraordinary contortions to prove that A, Sinovac, the least acceptable of the inoculations, is perfectly safe and perfectly sound, despite the fact that it took forever for the WHO to certify its validity, that it has a proven effectiveness of something like 50%, which is far below any other virus, any other vaccine. And they also are giving political advice. I mean, one of the reasons why the government, something I referred to earlier, is able to suppress the freedom of assembly is on the grounds of preventing the spread of the virus. Now, these medical advisors, who I thought were supposed to be looking at the science, not at the politics, are consistently advising the government that it's not a good idea for people to gather in open spaces. I mean, this is extraordinary. They are allowed to gather in closed spaces, not like churches and other places, but in open spaces. Why is this not allowed? Obviously, because that would allow demonstrations to take place. So they are subverting their integrity as people of science to make the case, which is purely a political case. What are the longer term effects of this? I don't know, but I do know that just from personal knowledge, doctors and other specialists are leaving in droves, not least because these are people who can find employment relatively easy elsewhere in the world. They're lost to Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, Steve. Can we turn now to Weir Hobhouse, who's the Member of Parliament for Bath and is the Lib Dem spokesman. So we're over to you. And then we've got questions in the chat from my colleague, Lord Dubbs, the Labour peer, and from Margaret Ferrier from the Scottish National Party. And if they want to ask those questions orally, then that's fine. If not, I'll ask them for you.
Thank you, David. And thank you so much, Stephen, for talking to us today and being so candid about your reasons why you didn't feel it was worth any longer to stay in Hong Kong. And you also say the people are leaving in droves. And of course, people are voting by their feet, but there are still very many people there from the international community who've been used to a free way of life. And I mean, will they really swallow all of that propaganda? You know, we talk about Afghanistan and say, you know, hopefully people in 20 years of US and UK occupation have seen an alternative to a repressive way of life. And surely in Hong Kong, it's in the DNA of the people that they know what politics is in the free world. So, you know, I still wonder how long people are just going to sort of sit there and take it. I know currently, of course, people are intimidated, big crackdowns on the protesters. So that's my one question. The other one is really the role of universities in Hong Kong. I mean, what's going to happen to those places of research and fact finding? You know, where are the academics going? Are they all going? And then what will the universities be like?
Well, can I just start with a response to that? Because in my other life, as a journalist, I was running catering outlets at universities, so I had a lot of contact in universities, rather not academic ones. And what is happening in universities is really fascinating. Number one, all of the leading positions have now been taken over. I mean, vice chancellors, principals, by politically connected figures. Either they are mainlanders or they are people who are known to be supportive of the Chinese Communist Party. Promotions now are largely confined to people who are politically acceptable. You do not find anybody being appointed as a head of a department or any senior position in a university now who is not politically acceptable. There hasn't, though, been quite the exodus of university professors and other academics that you might expect. One reason is that pay rates in Hong Kong universities are way above those in most other jurisdictions, particularly places like Britain. So for economic reasons, I understand people are reluctant to leave. But on the other hand, they're not going to be promoted. They're going to find it more and more difficult to publish their work, their research. I mean, they can go to international publishers, but that in itself can be risky with this ever-present paranoia about all things foreign. You know, oh, so-and-so has published in the American Journal of whatever. That looks like collaboration with foreign powers to me. So I think you're increasingly getting, but you have yet to see the product of this, fear and uncertainty in the university community. Then there is this point that you make about whether people who have a experience of knowing what's going on in the world, swallowing the propaganda that you now have from the regime. I think that on the whole, they're staggeringly unsuccessful. I mean, they're successful at shutting everybody up. That's true. There aren't demonstrations. There aren't newspapers left that reflect another point of view. In people's hearts, has anything changed? And what is so fascinating to me is that the smallest excuse for passive resistance is seized with both hands. On the day that Apple Daily was forced to close, it sold 1 million copies because people wanted to be seen going out there, buying Apple Daily, making the point. Now, 1 million copies in a population of 7.4 million, transpose that to Britain, that would mean you'd have to have a newspaper here selling tens of millions of copies. I don't believe, and I've been around newspapers for a long time, there is a single newspaper here that could achieve that. There was a concert, of course, now cancelled by the wonderful singer Denise Ho, who's very associated with the democracy movement. Sold out in nanoseconds as soon as it was announced and then inevitably cancelled. But, you know, people want to take what I call low-level resistance to make the point that they haven't swallowed the propaganda. But I think it is important also to recognize China does have genuine supporters in Hong Kong, particularly among the older generation. And I think the particular line of propaganda that they have swallowed, because they have this people, particularly, you know, in the age group, I would say beyond 60, have personal experience, because most of Hong Kong's population, of course, comes from the mainland. They were fleeing the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. They have the experience of disruption. They have the experience of what happens when you have a society engulfed by fervent political activity, and they think that the only way to maintain stability is to have a hardline government that tolerates no dissent. So it's certainly not true to say that China has no supporters in Hong Kong. It does, quite a lot of them. I mean, of course, you've got the opportunists, you know, the people who've quietly put away their American and British passports and declared themselves to be super patriots. Incidentally, this is my favorite subject, so permit me a small segue. It is astonishing that almost to a man and a woman, every single member of the Hong Kong elite ruling class has an exit route through foreign passports. The chief executive, Carrie Lam, has a husband and 2 sons holding British passports. She could come as a spouse. Don't know whether she'd be welcome in Britain, but she could. The Secretary for Security has means of exit through his wife. Tam Yu Chung, who is the most senior ranking politician in the Chinese political system through his membership of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, has a son sitting in Australia, not only with an Australian passport, but running a company organizing migration of people from the mainland and Hong Kong to China. I mean, goodness me, can you imagine if it was discovered that half the members of the House of Commons or the House of Lords were busy securing an exit to another country? I think there'd be some public comment on that.
Well, certainly one would hope there might be some public comment on it, Steve. I'll forbear to make any comment about the exit routes from Parliament to other jurisdictions. But can I paraphrase a question now that's in the chat from Lord Dubs, Alf Dubs, very senior Labour member of both houses over the distance, who says, thank you for a frank and informative talk, but so depressing. He said, I wish we could do something positive. Now, Margaret Ferrier has also put a question into the chat saying she was going to ask that too. And what can we do as parliamentarians, as it all seems so hopeless? And perhaps I can couple with that a question to you about, well, what could the UK government do? So here are some practical questions about what can parliamentarians do, but also what can the UK government do to show solidarity with journalists in Hong Kong?
Well, journalists and others, I suppose. I think that it's impossible to underestimate the importance of the British government's decision to allow holders of British national overseas passports to obtain a path to citizenship, in other words, a route of escape. I mean, as you know, because I know you campaigned on this, Britain resisted giving Hong Kongers with British passports the right of abode for many, many years, particularly at the time of the handover when this shoddy deal was done to give just 50,000 people, including Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong at the time, sorry, now, but at the time she wasn't, a British passport. It was a disgrace. Well, you know, good things happen, and that policy has been changed, and the very existence of an escape route, even if not taken, is vitally important. I don't believe that that policy is under review, and I very much hope that it won't be, but that's number one. I think the really important thing, and this is something that dictatorships declare they have no interest in. We don't care what you say. You know, they're like Millwall supporters. No one likes us and we don't care. I mean, if they had terraces to chant from, I'm sure they'd be doing it. They say that, but it's not true. That's why they have massive propaganda operations throughout the world. This new shiny TV station, endless newspaper supplements, blah, blah, blah. They do care. They really do care. And I think the fact that Hong Kong is kept in the limelight, that the plight of individuals and collectively Hong Kong is in the limelight, is a matter of concern to the Chinese authorities, who are hypersensitive to criticism, you know, ranting and raging at the smallest sign of criticism. So I very much hope that that level of focus will not be diminished. What I would take issue with, and I know that people advocate this, is whether imposing sanctions on either individuals or Chinese companies is a good idea. I understand the need for sanctions, or at least controls, over Chinese mainland companies with state connections operating in sensitive security areas overseas, including in Britain. I understand the need for that. Whether it's effective to impose other kinds of sanctions, I think is open to debate. But the very fact that there is intense monitoring, both of individuals and of corporations who seek to do business here or seek to operate television stations here as China does, that I think is important and presumably or hopefully will continue.
Thank you very much, Steve. Well, I think we're coming pretty well to a conclusion, an end of the discussion, and I'm going to invite you in a moment to just say some concluding remarks. I was struck by the comparison you just made between the CCP and Millwall supporters, and I agree with you, but I do think that people care far more about what people are saying about them and how they assess them than maybe sometimes we give credit for. And I'm always struck as well that even though the British Houses of Parliament may sometimes look as though they're past their sell-by date, nevertheless, there's still a resonance in what we say and do in this place. It's not maybe quite the city on the hill that is described by some of the early settlers in Massachusetts, but nevertheless, what we say and do in this place does have resonance, and it gives encouragement to people as well. And those who want to cling on and hope that better times will come, still look to us to speak out on their behalf. And I think that there is a duty on us anyway, given the privileges and freedoms that we enjoy here, to use them whenever we can. Of course, if you're going to end with a football anthem, then of course, as a Liverpool supporter, you won't be surprised that I would much rather hear the words "You'll never walk alone." And I think all of us on the call today would say that to the people of Hong Kong, that they won't walk alone, that we do stand with them, and that we share their feelings and their anxieties. In fact, the city of Liverpool, which I have the honor to represent in the House of Commons, has one of the oldest Chinese communities in this country, probably the oldest outside of London. And many of those people have settled in Liverpool because of things like the Cultural Revolution in the past. So we've seen those waves coming over the generations. But you're right, the BNO scheme, and the opportunities that has given for some Hong Kongers to be able to settle in this country, I welcome that. And I think the government did well to introduce that scheme and to accelerate it and to make it happen, and now to provide resources for settlement in the UK. And I think that that will enrich our life in this country, but I also think it will act as a beacon to people in Hong Kong, that the values that they have cherished are not dead, and that two systems, one country, it's an international treaty after all, is not dead in the water from a legal point of view or from a historic point of view. From a practical point of view, for the time being, maybe in Hong Kong, but I think that we must always use every effort we can to ensure that the ideals that we cherish and that are personified inside that agreement, that they are, the British Sino Agreement, are not allowed to just die and be forgotten. Now, Steve, over to you to say the concluding remarks, and then I'll wind the meeting up.
Well, can I just refer to your last point, which I do think is a very important one. The idea that China has been putting around, that the joint declaration, the treaty, the internationally recognized treaty, as you've said, under which Hong Kong's sovereignty was handed back to China, is being described in China as a historic document with no relevance to today. I didn't know treaties got abrogated quite in that way, but apparently if you sit in Beijing, they can be. So I very much hope, number one, that Britain will continue to insist on the continued relevance of the joint declaration. It was freely entered into by both parties, It was drafted by both parties. So the idea that Britain has no responsibility, no residual responsibility, is actually a contradiction of the terms of that treaty, which does give Britain not only a continuing monitoring role, but a continuing responsibility to uphold the very foundations of Hong Kong that were agreed back in the mid-1980s and signed off by both governments. I think it's also very important, even if, and I think most people do agree, even if it is the case that the Chinese authorities, the authorities in Beijing, take little notice of international opinion, the level of support that Hong Kong has from the world is of tremendous importance to people in Hong Kong. During the protests of 2019 particularly, I can't tell you how many rallies I attended where you saw British flags, where you saw American flags. One particular protest was full of Catalan flags after a relationship was established with members of the Catalan government. What it means to people in Hong Kong is they're not being forgotten, that the values that they're fighting for today are being echoed by the rest of the world. In other words, it's reassuring people that they haven't gone mad, that insisting on democracy and liberty in Hong Kong is not some quirky thing that can somehow be suppressed. It's a real thing. It brings Hong Kong into the rest of the world. You know, Hong Kong used to be sold as Asia's world city. The only people protecting the international relevance of Hong Kong now is not the government, who in fact are withdrawing from international fora in an extraordinary manner, but it's the people of Hong Kong themselves who in their hearts share the same sort of values as are common in liberal democracies. So the idea of maintaining that level of high profile support for Hong Kong, I think is really very important. And just finally, I would say that, you know, it's not only important, but people in Hong Kong do appreciate this. It may be that it sometimes takes a rather odd manifestation, as in fervent support for Donald Trump, who was regarded as the great savior of Hong Kong. I don't know how that impression arose, but it did. Or it may be for other reasons. But the fact that people of importance, people of some standing in other communities, haven't abandoned Hong Kong, that really means something.
Well, with perfect timing, Steve, perfect timing. We've reached 10:30, which is the closing time for the meeting. But I think that's a wonderful note on which to end as well, that the people of Hong Kong have not been abandoned. And we know that your writing will ensure as well in the future that you continue to tell their story in the way that you've always done, so truthfully and with such vigor over these, well, nearly 4 decades. So for all that you've done in the past, but for what you'll do in the future as well, I think many of us hold you in very high esteem and with great appreciation. So on behalf of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong, and on behalf of Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong, the grassroots organisation that has jointly hosted this meeting with the APPG, let me just thank you again and close the meeting, and thank colleagues who have joined us for being present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.